Hello again all. Sorry about this setup. My gimbal overheated and stopped working. So I am going to have to do this again. No big deal though. Going to talk about Peter's tomb here as an example of evidence you would think you'd find, given he was quite an important person to early Christianity. You know, upon this rock we'll build our church and so on. One of the most important apostles, John up there as well, obviously. But yeah, there's no good evidence for him until really the late second century and into the third. We're going to talk as well in the next video about second century archaeology, just generally. Because even that is so the first and second century archaeology of Christianity, anything at all, and we're going to find that there's actually not that much there. So let's read some essay. Historical evidence for Peter's tomb and early Christian persecution. I'm going to talk about persecution as well. Forgot that. Sorry. There's Peter's tomb's evidence, right? So no first century references. There are no first century references, Christian or otherwise, to the death, burial or tomb of Peter. This is in Rome, obviously, somewhere where we have a lot of people write things down. The New Testament is completely silent on Peter's death, and there is no archaeological or literary evidence from the first century regarding his final resting place. Irenaeus, 180 CE, source against heresies 332. The content states that Peter and Paul founded the church in Rome, and passed on the episcopate to Linus, but the reliability here does not mention Peter's tomb or location of death. It's written nearly 150 years after Peter's presumed death, likely based on theological tradition now, and an evolving tradition as well. Gaius of Rome, 200 CE, in the source quoted by Eusebius here. So Eusebius is writing in his ecclesiastical history 2:25, 6 and 7, and he mentions trophies, tropia of Peter and Paul at the Vatican and Ostian Way. Reliability trophies may refer to martyrdom shrines, not a literal tomb. The original text of Gaius is lost and only preserved via Eusebius. But this is 322 CE, so it's a late talk here, late mention. And we can't trust Eusebius necessarily. He has been shown to be a little dodgy sometimes. He leaves things out. Anyway, archaeological claim here, 20th century. Excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica in 1940 found remains of, in the 1940s, found remains of a 60 to 70 year old man, claimed to be Peter, but the reliability, the identification is speculative and controversial. No inscription or direct evidence links the bones to Peter. Conclusion on Peter's tomb: there is no evidence from the first century about Peter's death or burial. The first possible reference to a commemorative site appears around 200 CE, and the first physical claims date to the mid-20th century. Roman persecution of Christians in the first century, excluding Tacitus here. And we've been through many of these already. Suetonius 121 CE in Claudius 25:4 mentions Jews expelled from Rome due to disturbances instigated by Chrestus. Nero 16:2 notes that Christians were punished under Nero. The assessment is ambiguous. Chrestus likely refers to a Jewish agitator, and he was in Rome in the 50s. Now, Jesus didn't live to the 50s, and he never went to Rome. Problem. No detail of trials or executions, maybe based on Christian tradition, maybe. As well, because by Suetonius' time there might have been some primitive gospels laying around it which he might have had access to. We can't say it's an eyewitness account, can we? Pliny the Younger 112 CE, source epistles, okay, so these letters, 96 and 97, to the Emperor Trajan. The content describes interrogating and executing Christians in Bithynia. Notes he had never encountered such cases before, so he is not knowing of Christians. And he's an extremely powerful man with a huge amount of traction and, what's the word I'm looking for? Huge reach in his world. The reliability is quite high though for this. Right? It does seem to be that these letters did exist. Maybe, possibly, there are some people that dispute this now. And have written studies on this. This is the earliest dated Roman source describing Christian persecution, although local and not widespread. He's talking from Bithynia, 300 miles, I think, from Jerusalem. It is also post-1st century, of course. Conclusion on the 1st century persecution. Outside the interpolated Tacitus and Josephus, there is no solid Roman textual evidence of Christian persecution in the 1st century. Pliny's letter is the earliest reliable source, but dates from the early 2nd century. This is the first time we really get anything about Christianity if we discount Paul's letters and talk about the possibility of them actually not coming to us in any kind of final form until pretty much well into the 2nd century. Non-Christian references to Christian persecution now. Lucian of Samosata, 165 to 180. The source, the passing of Peregrinus. Mocks a philosopher who took advantage of Christian beliefs and martyrdom details. Assessment satirical but confirms Christianity. Christian martyrdom was known and mocked in the late 2nd century. Okay, so we're beginning to see Christians reliably come into the world here. Celsus 170 to 180 CE, the source, the true world, preserved by Origen. In contrast, Salsum content mentions Christian suffering, but in a polemical context. The assessment is not direct, but shows that Christians were associated with suffering and marginalization in around the 180s. Conclusion on the 2nd century external references. Lucian provides the clearest external reference to Christians undergoing persecution or self-sacrifice and martyrdom. Celsus, though indirect, affirms a similar understanding. These are the first non-Christian accounts post-Pliny that mention the phenomenon. So there is stuff going on here at least, but we don't know if it's persecution or prosecution, and that is an important thing to remember. In fact, the early centuries of the Christian era do not contain many martyrdom stories that are not heavily concocted, I'd say, mythologized or made after the fact by Christians who want to tell stories of martyrdom, because it's a big deal for Christians. It's important to lay down your life for Christ. The evidence is thin on the ground. Candida Moss, the myth of persecution. Final conclusion: historically reliable evidence for Peter's death or burial emerges only in the late 2nd to early 3rd century, and even then the sources are ambiguous or preserved second-hand. Roman persecution of Christians is not documented by Roman sources in the 1st century, except the dubious Tacitus passage. Go back to my the Pagan Witnesses videos, and you can watch all of them. I'm going to redo Tacitus and Josephus because they're very important. The earliest genuine external references come from Pliny 112 CE, followed by Lucian and Celsus in the latter half of the 2nd century. None of these support the picture of systematic or empire-wide persecution during the 1st century, as later Christian legends suggest. Celsus is great here. Read Celsus, and you get an understanding of what Christianity looked like to Rome at the time. And he mentions Christians constantly fighting. And I think it's quite obvious that it's very obvious that he's talking about different Christians with different ideas. And he doesn't mention, he just doesn't mention much that we find in the Gospels. He does, but he doesn't. It's always strange in the first 2 centuries, and it's always interesting to go back to Athanagoras of Athens and Minicius Felix to have a look at even Christians who are talking in the 2nd century and who do not appear to know any of the particulars in the 2nd century of Jesus's life as the Gospels portray it. They don't, no parables, no miracles, not really an earthly existence at all. It's all very strange. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there. Ciao for now.